In the scorching heat of a Texas afternoon, a group of outlaw bikers made the fatal mistake of threatening the wrong person at Miller's fuel stop. They couldn't have known that the quiet woman filling her tank was a decorated combat nurse with 3 tours in Iraq, one who was about to remind them why you should never judge a book by its cover. The sun hung low over Riverside Junction, casting long shadows across the cracked asphalt of the 3 highways that gave the small Texas town its name. The air was thick with the scent of gasoline and sun-baked concrete, broken only by the occasional breeze carrying dust from the endless stretch of road. Rachel Connor stood at pump number 4 of Miller's fuel stop, methodically filling the tank of her weathered Ford pickup. Her dark hair was pulled back in a tight bun, revealing features that somehow managed to look both gentle and hardened by experience. The sleeve of her light cotton shirt shifted slightly, revealing the edge of a scar, one of many souvenirs from her tours as a combat nurse in Iraq. Frank Miller, the station's owner, watched her from behind the counter through the store's dusty windows. He'd gotten used to seeing her these past few months ever since she'd moved to town. She was always polite, paid in cash, and kept to herself, the kind of customer he appreciated. But there was something in the way she carried herself, a constant awareness of her surroundings that reminded him of his own days in Korea. He recognized the look of someone who had seen too much but kept moving forward anyway. Inside the store, the ancient ceiling fan spun lazily, doing little to combat the Texas heat. The radio crackled with country music, interrupted occasionally by static and weather reports. It was a normal afternoon at Miller's fuel stop, the kind that blended into 100 others in this quiet corner of Texas. But that was about to change. The distant rumble of motorcycles grew steadily louder, building like an approaching storm. Rachel's hand paused on the pump handle, her body tensing almost imperceptibly. Years of trauma care in combat zones had taught her to trust her instincts, and right now, every one of them was on high alert. 6 motorcycles pulled into the station, their chrome gleaming under the harsh Texas sun. Their riders were a rough-looking bunch, leather-clad figures whose very presence seemed to change the atmosphere of the quiet station. Their bikes bore the emblem of a coiled serpent with blood-red eyes, the mark of the Iron Serpents, a gang whose reputation had been growing increasingly notorious in these parts. Their leader, a tall man with a thick beard and arms covered in tattoos, dismounted first. Jackson Chains Blackwood had a way of moving that suggested barely contained violence, like a predator sizing up its territory. His eyes scanned the station before landing on Rachel, lingering a moment too long before he turned to his crew with a smirk. Young Bobby Thompson, the teenage attendant working the afternoon shift, nervously watched through the store window as the bikers spread out across the station. Inside, Frank Miller's hand moved instinctively toward the shotgun he kept under the counter, his weathered fingers resting on the worn wood of the counter's edge. Rachel maintained her calm, finishing up at the pump with measured movements. She'd dealt with worse than this in Baghdad and Fallujah. The sound of heavy boots on pavement approached from behind, but she didn't turn around immediately. When she did, she found Chains standing too close, his imposing figure clearly meant to intimidate. "Nice day for a drive, isn't it, sweetheart?" he drawled, his voice carrying an edge that made Bobby flinch inside the store. Rachel met his gaze steadily, her response measured and calm. "Just getting gas." Chains chuckled, the sound devoid of any real humor. "Pretty lady like you shouldn't be out here alone. Roads can be dangerous." He gestured to his crew, who had positioned themselves around the station, their presence increasingly menacing. "Never know what kind of trouble you might run into." Through the store windows, Frank watched the scene unfold, his grip tightening on the counter. He'd seen that look before, back in Korea, the calm before the storm, the moment when everything could change in a heartbeat. Rachel's posture hadn't changed, but there was something in the way she held herself that spoke of steel beneath the surface. The tension in the air was palpable, thick as the heat waves rising from the asphalt. Rachel's mind flashed briefly to a dusty road outside Fallujah, another moment when the air had felt this heavy with threat. Her voice, when she spoke again, carried the quiet authority of someone who had faced down far worse than a gang of bikers. "I appreciate the concern, she said, each word precise and clear. "But I can handle myself just fine." Chains' smirk widened, but there was anger in his eyes now, the kind that came from not getting the fearful response he'd expected. He stepped closer, invading her space deliberately. "Maybe you don't understand how things work around here, sweetheart. See, this is our territory now, and—" The words died in his throat as Rachel's eyes met his, and for the first time, he saw what Frank had recognized earlier, the look of someone who had seen real war, who had faced real monsters, and had emerged stronger for it. The confrontation at Miller's fuel stop shifted like a rattlesnake coiling before a strike. Chain's crew had spread out across the station, their boots scuffing against the sun-bleached concrete as they positioned themselves strategically. Two of them lingered near the store entrance, casting long shadows through the dusty windows. Another pair circled around Rachel's pickup, their fingers trailing along its weathered paint in a deliberate show of threat. Inside the store, Frank Miller's grip hadn't left the counter's edge. His eyes darted between Rachel and the bikers, noting how the Iron Serpents had effectively surrounded the station. Bobby Thompson stood frozen behind the register, his young face pale with worry. The radio continued its quiet drone of country music, an oddly peaceful backdrop to the mounting tension. The afternoon sun glinted off the chrome of the motorcycles, their engines still ticking as they cooled in the Texas heat. "See, here's the thing," Chains continued, his voice taking on a theatrical quality meant for his audience of fellow bikers. "We've been expanding our territory, making sure everyone understands the new arrangement. Businesses pay for protection, and in return, nothing bad happens to them." He gestured broadly at the station. "Old Frank in there hasn't quite gotten with the program yet." Rachel's gaze flicked briefly toward the store, catching Frank's worried expression. She noticed how his right hand had disappeared beneath the counter, likely resting on the shotgun she'd glimpsed during previous visits. The situation was balanced on a knife's edge, and she knew from experience how quickly things could spiral out of control. Her mind cataloged every detail, the distance to her truck, the positions of each biker, the way the wind carried the scent of gasoline and leather across the station. One of the bikers, a wiry man with a snake tattoo crawling up his neck, knocked over a display of windshield washer fluid. The containers clattered across the pavement, the sound making Bobby jump inside the store. The biker laughed, a harsh sound that carried across the station. His boots crunched over the scattered containers as he kicked them aside, blue fluid spreading across the hot concrete like spilled blood. "Oops," he called out, his voice dripping with mock concern. "Looks like accidents can happen real easy around here." Rachel remained still, her mind racing through scenarios like she used to do in combat triage. She noted exits, positions, potential weapons. The weight of her military ID in her back pocket felt suddenly significant, not for the identification, but for the sharp edges of the metal clip that held it. Her fingers flexed slightly, muscle memory from years of handling emergency situations in war zones taking over. "Frank's a good man," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the station. "And this is a good town. It doesn't need your kind of protection." Chains' smirk faltered slightly, replaced by something harder. The sun caught the silver serpent pendant hanging from his neck, making it seem to writhe as he moved. "You got a mouth on you, sweetheart. Might want to watch that before someone takes offense." "I've been called worse by better," Rachel replied evenly, the ghost of mortar fire and battlefield chaos echoing in her memory. "And I'm not your sweetheart." The change in Chains was immediate. His facade of casual menace dropped, replaced by raw anger. He stepped forward, closing the distance between them until he was looming over her. Behind him, his crew tensed, ready for action. The air seemed to thicken with the promise of violence, heavy as the approaching evening. "You think you're tough?" he snarled, his breath hot against her face. "You think because you can stand here and talk back, you're something special? Let me tell you how this ends. Either old Frank in there starts paying up, or his nice little station starts having problems. Lots of problems." Rachel didn't back down. Her time in Iraq had taught her that showing fear often led to worse outcomes. Instead, she met his gaze steadily, her voice taking on the same tone she'd used to command medical evacuations under fire. The memories of those moments, the chaos, the screams, the need to remain calm in the face of death, strengthened her resolve. "Let me tell you how this really ends," she said quietly, but with steel in her voice. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. You and your crew are going to get on your bikes and ride away. You're going to leave Frank, this station, and this town alone, because if you don't, you're going to learn some very painful lessons about underestimating people. A tense silence followed her words, broken only by the distant sound of highway traffic and the continued drone of the radio. The other bikers exchanged glances, clearly unsure about this unexpected resistance. They were used to intimidation working quickly, to people backing down at the first show of force. The late afternoon sun cast their shadows long across the station, like dark fingers reaching across the pavement. Chain's hand shot out, grabbing Rachel's arm where her scar showed beneath her sleeve. "You threatening me, girl?" Rachel looked down at his hand, then back up to his face. Her expression hadn't changed, but something in her eyes made him hesitate. It was the look of someone who had dealt with far worse than him, who had saved lives and taken them when necessary, who understood precisely what violence really meant. The scar beneath his grip had come from a mortar round that had killed 2 of her patients. This man's grip couldn't compare to that memory. "I don't make threats," she said calmly. "I'm just explaining how things are going to be. Your choice if you want to learn the hard way." The tension crackled like static electricity in the dry Texas air. Inside the store, Frank's hand tightened on his shotgun, and Bobby held his breath. The next few moments would determine whether the situation exploded into violence or if someone would back down. And Rachel Connor, veteran of 3 tours in Iraq's worst combat zones, was absolutely certain it wouldn't be her. Chains' grip on Rachel's arm tightened, his knuckles whitening with pressure. The tension at Miller's fuel stop had reached its breaking point, the Texas air so thick with anticipation, it felt like breathing through sand. The other Iron Serpents had drawn closer, forming a loose circle around their leader and the woman who dared to challenge him. Their leather vests creaked as they moved, the embroidered serpents on their backs seeming to writhe in the shimmering heat waves. Inside the store, Bobby Thompson's hand hovered over the emergency button beneath the counter, his yambesa, a mask of indecision. Frank Miller hadn't moved, but his eyes never left the scene unfolding outside, decades of military instinct telling him this situation was about to explode. With deliberate slowness, Rachel's free hand moved to rest on top of Chains' grip. Her touch was precise, clinical, the same way she used to position her hands before treating battlefield wounds. 3 seconds, she said quietly, her voice carrying the calm authority of someone used to giving orders in chaos. "That's how long you have to remove your hand." Chains barked out a laugh, but there was a note of uncertainty in it now. The woman's composure was unsettling. Victims weren't supposed to act this way. "Or what, sweetheart? You'll—" Rachel's movement was lightning fast, a blur of precise action honed by years of emergency response. Her thumb found the pressure point between Chains' thumb and forefinger, pressing with expert precision while her other hand twisted his wrist at exactly the right angle. The combination sent shooting pain up his arm, forcing his fingers to release involuntarily. Chains stumbled back, more from surprise than pain, his face contorting with rage and disbelief. 2 of his crew moved forward, but Rachel's voice stopped them cold. "Before you try anything stupid," she said, still maintaining that unnerving calm, "remember that I've spent years learning exactly how the human body breaks. I can put you back together, but I can also take you apart." The weight of her words hung in the air, backed by the unmistakable confidence of someone who knew exactly what they were talking about. One of the bikers, the one with the snake tattoo on his neck, shifted uncomfortably. He'd seen enough fights to recognize when someone knew what they were doing. "You little—" Chains started forward again, but Rachel's stance changed subtly. It wasn't much, just a slight shift in her weight, a marginal adjustment of her position. But it was enough to make him hesitate. There was something familiar about it, something that triggered warnings in his hindbrain. "Last chance," Rachel said, her voice carrying across the station. "Get on your bikes and leave. Find somewhere else to cause trouble." Her eyes scanned the group, noting their positions, their stances, their levels of commitment. It was the same way she used to survey a battlefield triage situation, assessing threats, calculating priorities. Inside the store, Bobby's hand had moved away from the emergency button. He was watching Rachel with a mix of fear and awe, suddenly understanding why this quiet customer always seemed different from the others. Frank's expression had changed too, recognition dawning in his eyes. He'd seen that look before in Korea, the look of someone who had danced with death and learned all its steps. The wiry biker with the neck tattoo took a step back, his boot crunching in the spilled windshield washer fluid. "Chains," he said, his voice low. "Maybe we should—" "Shut up!" Chains snapped, but his authority was cracking. The image he'd carefully cultivated, the fearsome leader of the Iron Serpents, was being undermined by this woman who showed no fear. Worse, she looked at him the way a doctor might look at a particularly unpleasant condition that needed to be treated. The sound of an approaching vehicle broke the tension momentarily. A dusty police cruiser pulled into the station, and Deputy Kate Wilson stepped out, her hand resting casually on her holstered weapon. She took in the scene with the sharp eyes of someone used to reading situations quickly. "Everything all right here?" she asked, though her tone suggested she knew exactly what she was walking into. Rachel didn't take her eyes off Chains. "Just explaining some basic anatomy to these gentlemen," she said calmly. They were about to leave. The deputy's arrival had shifted the dynamics. The Iron Serpents were bold, but they preferred to operate without official attention. Chains looked between Rachel and the deputy, his jaw working as he calculated his options. Finally, he spat on the ground near Rachel's boots. "This isn't over," he growled, trying to salvage some authority from the situation. Rachel's response was quiet, but clear. "Yes, it is. You just don't know it yet." The bikers mounted their machines, engines roaring to life in a cacophony of barely contained power. As they pulled away, Chains shot one last venomous look at Rachel, but she had already turned away, dismissing him as a threat that had been neutralized. The dust from their departure was still settling when Deputy Wilson approached Rachel. "Want to tell me what that was all about?" Rachel watched the bikers disappear down the highway, their engines growing fainter with distance. "Just some people learning about personal space and proper manners," she replied, then added more seriously, "But they'll be back. Men like that can't handle being humiliated." The deputy nodded, understanding the warning in Rachel's words. "You handled yourself well." "Military?" "Combat nurse. 3 tours in Iraq." Recognition flickered in Deputy Wilson's eyes. She'd seen enough veterans to know the look, the bearing, the way they carried themselves. "They're going to be trouble," she said, watching the horizon where the bikers had vanished. Rachel nodded, her mind already working through scenarios, planning for what would come next. "Yes," she agreed, "they will be." The incident at Miller's fuel stop spread through Riverside Junction like wildfire, growing more dramatic with each retelling. By the following afternoon, Bobby Thompson's account of how the quiet combat nurse had stood up to the Iron Serpents had reached nearly every corner of the small Texas town. Some versions claimed she'd put 3 bikers in the hospital. Others swore she disarmed Chains, with nothing but her thumb and a stern look. The truth, as Rachel knew, was far more concerning than any rumor. She pulled into the station just as the sun was reaching its zenith, the Texas heat making the air shimmer above the pavement. Frank Miller was outside hosing down the area where yesterday's windshield washer fluid had spilled. He straightened when he saw her truck, his weathered face creasing with concern. "Figured you'd be back," he said as she stepped out of her vehicle. "Been keeping an eye out since yesterday." He gestured toward the store. Got some coffee on if you're interested. Think we need to talk. Inside, the ancient ceiling fan was fighting its usual losing battle against the heat. Bobby was stocking shelves, but his eyes lit up when Rachel entered. The teenager had been regaling customers all morning with his version of yesterday's events, each telling more elaborate than the last. Frank poured 3 cups of coffee, setting them on the small table near the back of the store. "Bobby," he called, "take a break. You should hear this, too." The old Korean War veteran's voice carried a gravity that made the teenager hurry over. Rachel took a seat, wrapping her hands around the warm cup despite the heat. Her eyes remained fixed on the window, scanning the street beyond out of habit. "They'll be back," she said without preamble. "And next time they won't be testing the waters." Frank nodded grimly. "Already started. Got a call this morning from Pete's Hardware down the road. Someone slashed his delivery truck's tires last night. Message was pretty clear." Bobby shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "But Deputy Wilson—" "Can't be everywhere," Rachel finished, "and the Iron Serpents know that." She took a sip of coffee, her mind working through scenarios like she used to do in the combat hospital. They're going to try to isolate businesses, make examples. It's the same pattern I saw with insurgents in Iraq, break down community resistance piece by piece. Frank's expression hardened. Seen something similar in Korea. They start small, work their way up until people are too scared to fight back. He paused, studying Rachel carefully. "Question is, what are we going to do about it?" Before Rachel could respond, the door chimed. Dr. Sarah Chen from the local clinic walked in, her face tight with concern. "Frank," she said, then noticed Rachel and seemed relieved. "Good, you're here too. We need to talk about what happened at Pete's." "The tires?" Frank asked, but Dr. Chen shook her head. "No, just now. 2 of them showed up at his store, started breaking windows. Pete tried to stop them." She took a deep breath. "He's at my clinic with a broken arm. Said they told him it was a message for anyone thinking about playing hero." Rachel's jaw tightened. The escalation was happening faster than she'd expected. She could almost hear the echoes of mortar fire. Remember the way violence could spiral out of control in seconds. "They're moving quickly," she said, standing up. "They want to establish control before the community can organize." "Already happening," Dr. Chen replied. "Maria Delgado from the high school is rallying people. There's a meeting tonight at the community center. After what you did yesterday, well, people are talking about standing up to them." Rachel shook her head. "That's exactly what they're counting on. Unorganized resistance gives them an excuse for more violence." She turned to Frank. "We need to be smarter about this, strategic." Frank nodded, understanding in his eyes. "Like a military operation." "Exactly. We need coordination, communication, and most importantly, we need to avoid giving them easy targets." Rachel's mind was already mapping out plans, the same way she used to organize medical responses under fire. "Bobby, what time is that meeting tonight?" 7, the teenager replied eagerly. "Half the town's going to be there." "Good, but we need to be careful. The Iron Serpents will be watching." Rachel's expression was grim. "We're not just dealing with thugs anymore. This is turning into a war for the town's soul." Dr. Chen's phone buzzed, another patient needing attention. As she hurried out, she paused at the door. "Rachel, what you did yesterday, it gave people hope. But Pete's arm, they're scared again." Rachel watched her leave, remembering similar moments in Iraq, the delicate balance between hope and fear, courage and caution. "Fear can be useful," she said quietly, more to herself than the others. "It keeps you alert, makes you think before acting, but it can't be allowed to paralyze you." Frank retrieved his shotgun from under the counter, checking it with practiced hands. "So we fight?" "No," Rachel replied, her voice firm. "We defend. There's a difference." She turned to Bobby, seeing the mixture of excitement and fear in his young face. "And we do it smart. No heroes, no lone stands. We work together, or we don't work at all." The afternoon sun cast long shadows through the store windows as they began to plan. Rachel knew that somewhere out there, Chains and his Iron Serpents were planning too. The next confrontation wouldn't be a simple show of force at a gas station. It would be a calculated attempt to break the town's will to resist. But they didn't know what Rachel knew. That sometimes the strongest people were the ones who had already been broken and put themselves back together. She had learned that lesson in the dust and blood of Iraq, and now she would teach it to Riverside Junction. The community center buzzed with nervous energy as Riverside Junction's residents filed in for the meeting. The old building's air conditioning struggled against both the Texas heat and the body heat of the crowd that had gathered. Rachel stood at the back, leaning against the wall near the exit, her combat-trained eyes continuously scanning the room and the streets visible through the windows. Maria Delgado, the high school teacher who had called the meeting, stood at the front, her usual classroom confidence somewhat shaken by the gravity of the situation. The crowd was larger than anyone had expected. Shopkeepers, ranchers, mechanics, and families packed the rows of folding chairs. Deputy Kate Wilson stood near another exit, her uniform a reminder of official authority, even if everyone knew the local law enforcement was stretched thin. "We all know why we're here," Maria began, her voice carrying over the murmurs of the crowd. "The Iron Serpents aren't just passing through anymore, they're trying to take over our town piece by piece." A ripple of angry mutters spread through the room. Pete from the hardware store sat in the front row, his arm in a fresh cast, his face a mix of pain and determination. His wife Susan kept glancing nervously at the windows, as if expecting leather-clad figures to appear at any moment. "They broke Pete's arm today," Maria continued, her voice hardening. "They're slashing tires, breaking windows, threatening our families. But yesterday, someone showed them we don't have to take it." She looked toward Rachel, and heads turned to follow her gaze. Someone stood up to them. Rachel straightened slightly but didn't move from her position. She noticed Dr. Chen slip into the meeting late, still wearing her clinic coat, probably coming straight from treating another patient. Frank Miller sat nearby, his expression grim, while Bobby Thompson practically vibrated with poorly contained energy next to him. James Washington, who owned the auto repair shop next to Miller's fuel stop, stood up. Standing up is one thing, but these aren't just rowdy bikers. They're organized, they're violent, and they're not going to stop because one person embarrassed their leader. "He's right," Rachel spoke for the first time, her voice cutting through the concerned murmurs. She pushed off from the wall and walked to the front, every eye following her movement. "This isn't about one confrontation or one show of resistance. The Iron Serpents are waging a campaign of intimidation, and they're counting on us to make mistakes." "So what do we do?" someone called from the crowd. "Just let them take over?" Rachel shook her head, falling naturally into the role of briefing others, just as she had done countless times in combat hospitals. "We organize, we coordinate, we protect each other, but most importantly, we don't give them what they want: chaos and easy targets." Deputy Wilson stepped forward. "I've called in help from the county, but they're stretched thin. We can't rely on official channels alone." "Then we help ourselves," Frank Miller declared, standing up. "Like we used to do. My father told me stories about how this town handled trouble during the Depression. People looked out for each other, had systems in place." Rachel nodded, memories of organizing medical response teams in war zones surfacing. "We create a network. Communication chains, buddy systems for businesses, designated safe houses." She turned to Maria. "The school has a good view of the main street. We can use it as an observation point." Dr. Chen raised her hand. "The clinic's always open. We can be a central point for information. People come and go all day. It won't look suspicious." The energy in the room began to shift from fear to purpose as Rachel outlined her plan. We divide the town into sectors. Each sector has a coordinator who organizes watches and responses. We use text chains, but nothing written about specific plans. They might be monitoring phones. Like a military operation, Bobby said excitedly, earning a sharp look from Frank. Like a community protecting itself, Rachel corrected. We're not soldiers, and this isn't a war. We're citizens defending our home, which means we have to be smarter, more organized, and more disciplined than they expect. Maria pulled out a town map, spreading it on a table at the front. People gathered around as Rachel marked key points, businesses that needed protection, observation posts, communication hubs. The room hummed with renewed purpose as assignments were made and schedules organized. Remember, Rachel emphasized, her voice carrying the weight of someone who had seen plans succeed and fail in life-or-death situations. No one acts alone. No heroics. We work together, we watch out for each other, and we don't give them any easy victories. As the meeting continued, Rachel noticed Deputy Wilson watching her with a thoughtful expression. The deputy moved closer, speaking quietly. You've done this before, haven't you? Organized people in crisis? Rachel's mind flashed to a makeshift hospital outside Fallujah, organizing civilian protection during a siege. Different context, same principles. People need structure to overcome fear. They need to know they're not alone. The meeting ran late into the evening, but when people finally began to leave, they moved with purpose rather than fear. Rachel watched them go, noting how they naturally fell into groups, already implementing the buddy system she'd suggested. The Iron Serpents had expected to find a soft target in Riverside Junction. Instead, they'd stumbled into a community that was learning to fight back, not with violence, but with organization and unity. As she helped Maria and Frank clean up the community center, Rachel couldn't shake the feeling that somewhere out there, Chains was planning his response. The real test wasn't today's meeting or yesterday's confrontation. It would come when the Iron Serpents realized they were facing more than just scattered resistance. Rachel spent the next morning watching Riverside Junction transform. The changes were subtle, detectable only to someone trained to notice patterns. Shopkeepers installed new security cameras, their lenses strategically placed to cover each other's blind spots. Teenagers on bikes casually circled the streets, cell phones ready to text at the first sign of trouble. Neighbors who had barely spoken before now checked on each other regularly, a quiet network of vigilance taking shape. At Miller's fuel stop, Frank had installed additional lights around the perimeter, their bright beams eliminating potential hiding spots. Bobby Thompson worked with newfound purpose, his young eyes constantly scanning the horizon while maintaining radio contact with other businesses. The old Korean War veteran had taught him military hand signals, a silent language of warning and all clear signs. Dr. Chen's clinic had become an unofficial command center. People cycled through regularly, ostensibly for medical reasons, but really to share information and coordinate responses. The doctor kept a detailed log of suspicious activities, disguised as patient notes, a system Rachel had helped her develop based on combat hospital protocols. 3 more incidents last night, Dr. Chen reported when Rachel stopped by, pretending to pick up bandages. Graffiti at the supermarket, someone tried to intimidate Mrs. Rodriguez at the bakery, and they're still circling the high school during lunch hours. Rachel absorbed the information, her mind mapping the pattern. They're testing our responses, watching how we react. Notice they haven't hit the same place twice? They're probing for weak points. James Washington arrived at the clinic, grease still on his hands from the auto shop. Got something you need to hear, he said quietly. One of my customers spotted a new group of bikes heading into town. At least 10, maybe more. They're gathering reinforcements. This news sent a chill through the room. Rachel had expected this. Men like Chains didn't take humiliation lightly. How long? She asked. Day, maybe 2 before they make their move, James replied. They're holed up at the old warehouse off Route 12. Rachel nodded, remembering similar situations in Iraq where insurgents would gather strength before striking. Tell Maria to keep the students inside during lunch. James, spread the word. Nobody works alone, especially after dark, and we need eyes on that warehouse. Deputy Wilson arrived as they were talking, her uniform dusty from patrol. County finally got back to me, she said, frustration evident in her voice. They can send help, but not for at least a week. Budget cuts, short staffing, the usual excuses. We'll have to hold until then, Rachel replied, her mind already formulating contingencies. How's the radio network coming? Got 6 businesses hooked up so far, the deputy confirmed. Frank's teaching everyone the codes. Simple stuff. Weather terms for different situations. Cloudy means trouble brewing. Storm coming means immediate threat. The clinic door chimed as Maria Delgado entered, looking worried. We've got a situation at the school, she said, without preamble. 3 bikes circling closer than usual. They're taking pictures of the kids during recess. Rachel's jaw tightened. Using children as leverage was a line she wouldn't allow them to cross. Get the students inside. Bobby's got a camera set up on the gas station roof. We'll get pictures of our own, start building files on each member. The day progressed with a tense efficiency. Rachel moved through town, checking defensive preparations, adjusting plans, strengthening weak points. She helped Frank install motion sensors around the gas pumps, showed Mrs. Rodriguez how to set up a silent alarm at the bakery, and worked with James to establish escape routes through the auto shop's back lot. By late afternoon, she found herself back at Miller's fuel stop, reviewing the day's intelligence with Frank and Deputy Wilson. The old ceiling fan spun above them as they marked incident locations on a map spread across the counter. They're moving in a pattern, Rachel explained, pointing to the markers. Clockwise around the town, but never predictable enough to catch. Classic insurgency tactics. Keep the population off balance, make them feel watched from all angles. Frank studied the map, his Korean War experience lending weight to his observations. They're tightening the circle. Each incident brings them closer to the center of town. Building pressure, Rachel agreed. They want us to crack, to make mistakes. That's when they'll hit hard. Deputy Wilson's radio crackled. Another incident, this time at the edge of town. She stood to leave but paused, looking at Rachel. You've seen this before, haven't you? Not just in Iraq, this kind of organized intimidation. Rachel's expression remained neutral, but her eyes hardened slightly. Different places, same tactics. People who prey on communities always follow similar patterns. They're counting on fear and isolation to do their work for them. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the gas station's weathered concrete, Rachel watched the town's new defensive network in action. Lights came on in coordinated patterns, volunteers moved in practiced formations, and information flowed through carefully established channels. The Iron Serpents were gathering strength for their next move, but they would find Riverside Junction changed. The quiet Texas town was no longer an easy target. It was becoming a fortress, its strength not in walls or weapons, but in the unity of its people. Rachel checked her watch, knowing that somewhere out there Chains was planning his response. The real test would come soon, and when it did, the town would need every bit of preparation they'd put in place. The combat nurse had seen enough battles to know that the next few days would determine everything. The first real test of Riverside Junction's defenses came 3 days later, just as the sun began to dip below the Texas horizon. Rachel was helping Frank close up the gas station when Bobby's voice crackled over the radio, using their predetermined weather code. Storm front approaching from the south, looks like heavy clouds. Through the evening haze, they could hear the distant rumble of motorcycles, not the usual small groups, but something larger. Rachel's combat-trained senses immediately went on high alert. She grabbed the radio, her voice calm but authoritative. All points, status check. Doctor, how's the weather at the clinic? Dr. Chen's response came quickly. Clear here, but I can hear the thunder. Translation. No immediate threat, but she could hear the bikes approaching. The Iron Serpents had chosen their timing well. Most businesses were closing, people were heading home, and the transition would make coordination more difficult. Rachel watched as the town's new defense network sprang into action. Lights clicked on in sequence, doors were secured, and observers took their positions. I count 15 bikes, maybe more, Bobby reported from his observation post on the gas station roof. His voice trembled slightly, but held steady. They're splitting up at Mason Street. Rachel moved to the store's front window, her mind already calculating angles and approaches. Frank, hit the floodlights. Deputy Wilson, what's your position? 2 minutes out, came the response through static. Got eyes on 3 of them heading toward the school. The roar of motorcycles grew louder as the first group approached Miller's fuel stop. Rachel recognized Chains at the lead, his leather vest adorned with new patches, probably meant to showcase his reinforcements' credentials. 5 bikes pulled into the station, while others could be seen circling nearby streets. Remember the plan, Rachel broadcasted to all points. No one engages alone. Keep your distance. Keep recording. Chains killed his engine, the sudden silence more threatening than the noise had been. His new reinforcements were different from his usual crew, harder looking, with prison tattoos and eyes that spoke of real violence. They spread out across the station with practiced efficiency. Well, Chains called out, his voice carrying across the parking lot. Looks like the nurse is working late again. His tone was casual, but Rachel could sense the anger simmering beneath it. Brought some friends to check on the town's health. Inside the store, Frank had positioned himself behind the counter, his shotgun hidden, but ready. Bobby had gone silent on the radio, following protocol to maintain observation without revealing his position. Rachel stepped outside, moving with deliberate calm. Her time in Iraq had taught her that body language could be as important as words in these situations. We're closed, she said simply, her voice carrying clearly in the evening air. One of the new bikers, a massive man with a shaved head and a scar running down his neck, spat on the ground. Ain't here for gas, sweetheart. Here to teach some lessons about respect. Through her earpiece, Rachel could hear reports coming in from around town. The Iron Serpents were making similar shows of force at key locations, the school, the clinic, the main street shops. It was a coordinated effort to overwhelm the town's defenses. Last time you were here, Rachel said, addressing Chains directly, you left with a lesson of your own. Want to try for another? Chains's face darkened, but before he could respond, the sound of breaking glass echoed from somewhere in town, followed by the quick reports of multiple observers calling in the incident. The Iron Serpents had launched their first real attack. All points hold position, Rachel commanded into her radio, never taking her eyes off Chains. Follow protocols. The biker leader's smile widened. Hear that? That's just the beginning. By morning, this town's going to understand exactly who's in charge. He gestured to his men who began moving closer, their boots scraping against the concrete. Rachel stood her ground, her mind racing through combat triage protocols. Assess threats. Prioritize responses. Maintain control. She could hear Deputy Wilson coordinating responses through her earpiece, the town's defensive network shifting to contain multiple incidents. You really don't understand what's happening here, do you? Rachel said, her voice taking on the same tone she'd used to command medical evacuations under fire. Look around, Chains. Really look. As if on cue, lights began flicking on throughout the town. Not just security lights, but house lights, shop lights, street lamps. A coordinated illumination that eliminated every shadow where trouble could hide. Cameras whirred and clicked from dozens of hidden locations, documenting every move. Chains hesitated for a fraction of a second, his eyes darting around as he registered the changes in the town's landscape. The gas station was no longer an isolated target. It was part of a coordinated defense network. You're not facing a scared town anymore, Rachel continued, taking a step forward. You're facing a community that's learned to fight back. Every move you make is being recorded, every threat documented. How long do you think you can keep this up before bigger agencies take notice? The distant sound of sirens began to grow louder. Not just Deputy Wilson's patrol car, but others, called in from neighboring towns as part of their contingency planning. The Iron Serpents shifted uneasily, their formation losing its precision as uncertainty crept in. Choice is yours, Rachel said, her voice carrying across the now silent station. But whatever you decide, know that Riverside Junction isn't playing by your rules anymore. We've got our own. The Iron Serpents' first coordinated attack on Riverside Junction lasted well into the night. While Chains and his group maintained their tense standoff at Miller's fuel stop, reports kept flowing in through the radio network of incidents across town. Windows shattered at the supermarket, tires were slashed behind the hardware store, and threatening messages were spray-painted across the high school's walls. Yet something was different this time. Each act of vandalism was met with an organized response. Security cameras captured clear images of the perpetrators. Citizens logged license plate numbers from safe observation posts. Deputy Wilson and her hastily assembled network of volunteer deputies maintained a steady presence, appearing quickly at each incident. Rachel stayed at her post at the gas station, knowing that Chains was watching her, testing her resolve. His reinforcements circled the property like sharks, their bikes rumbling in the darkness beyond the floodlight's reach. The massive biker with the neck scar, someone had called him Butcher over the radio, kept cracking his knuckles, clearly itching for violence. "You know what your problem is?" Chains said, breaking the tense silence. "You think because you played nurse in some sandbox war, you understand real violence. But we're not playing by military rules here." Rachel's expression didn't change, but her mind flashed to a field hospital outside Fallujah, to the aftermath of a marketplace bombing. "That's where you're wrong," she replied evenly. "I understand violence better than you ever will. I've seen what it does, what it really costs. That's why I know how this ends." Through her earpiece, she could hear the town's defense network adapting and responding. Dr. Chen was coordinating with observers near the clinic, tracking motorcycle movements. Maria Delgado had activated the school's new security system, filling dark corners with sudden light when bikers approached. James Washington and his mechanics had formed a roving patrol, their trucks moving through backstreets in practiced patterns. "Getting awful crowded out there," Frank called from the store's doorway, his voice carrying a deliberate warning. More vehicles were arriving, not just local law enforcement, but trucks filled with townspeople. They kept their distance but established a clear presence. The Iron Serpents were no longer facing isolated targets. Butcher revved his engine, the sound aggressive in the night air. "Let's just burn this place down," he growled. "Show them what happens when they—" "Try it," Rachel cut him off, her voice taking on the same tone she'd used to command emergency evacuations. "See those cameras? That's live footage going to every law enforcement agency in 3 counties. You really want to add arson to your record?" She could see the calculation in Chain's eyes. The Iron Serpents had built their power through intimidation, striking fast and fading away before consequences caught up with them. But now they faced a community that had learned to fight back with documentation, coordination, and unwavering resolve. Bobby's voice crackled over the radio. "More trucks arriving from the north. Peterson's boys from the ranch, looks like, and Mr. Washington's crew is 2 blocks out." Rachel allowed herself a small smile. The town's response was exactly what they'd planned for, not direct confrontation, but a show of unified strength. Every time the Iron Serpent struck at one point, the community responded with overwhelming presence at 3 others. Chains stood up from his bike, his frustration visible in every movement. "You think these little cameras scare us? Think having some farmers and mechanics playing a watchdog is going to stop what's coming?" "No," Rachel replied calmly. "But every image, every report, every documented incident adds up. The county sheriff might be delayed, but federal agencies move faster when they see organized criminal activity. How many of your new friends are already on parole?" The question hit home. Several of the reinforcements shifted uneasily on their bikes. Running from local cops was one thing, attracting federal attention was another entirely. A series of sharp pops echoed from downtown. Someone had thrown firecrackers at the clinic. But instead of causing panic, the sound was met with an immediate response. Lights blazed on, cameras whirred, and within moments Deputy Wilson's voice reported 2 arrests. "Your tactics don't work anymore," Rachel continued, her voice carrying across the gas station lot. "Every attack makes our case stronger. Every threat gets documented. You're not fighting scared individuals now, you're facing a community that's learned how to defend itself. The sound of approaching vehicles grew louder. James Washington's trucks appeared at one end of the street while ranchers' pickups blocked the other. They didn't advance, they didn't need to. Their presence sent a clear message. The Iron Serpents were surrounded by witnesses, cameras, and determined citizens. Chains looked around, seeing his advantage slipping away. The fear he'd counted on had been replaced by something else. Organization, unity, and a calm determination that was more threatening than any show of force. "This ain't over," he snarled, but the threat sounded hollow even to his own ears. "Yes, it is," Rachel responded, just as she had during their first encounter. "You just don't know it yet." The Iron Serpents began to pull out, their departure trying to maintain an air of menace but coming across as retreat. As they rode away, Rachel could hear the town's network tracking their movements, documenting every turn, every license plate, every face caught in security footage. The first major test of Riverside Junction's defenses had ended not with violence, but with the power of united resistance. Yet Rachel knew this was just the beginning. Men like Chains didn't accept defeat easily. They came back harder, more desperate, more dangerous. But watching the townspeople emerge from their observation posts, seeing their quiet pride and determination, she knew they would be ready. The combat nurse had taught them well. The next 3 days in Riverside Junction passed in a state of tense anticipation. The Iron Serpents hadn't left the area entirely. Observers regularly reported motorcycles circling the outskirts of town, watching, waiting. Rachel recognized the pattern from her combat days. The calm before a storm, the gathering of forces before a major offensive. She spent these days strengthening the town's defenses, drawing on every lesson she'd learned in Iraq. Each business now had multiple cameras, their feeds monitored in rotation by volunteers. The old CB radio network had been expanded, giving them coverage across town. Every street had designated safe houses, and every resident knew the warning signs to watch for. "They're planning something big," Rachel explained during an emergency meeting at the clinic. The usual crowd had gathered: Frank Miller, Deputy Wilson, Dr. Chen, Maria Delgado, and James Washington. Bobby Thompson sat in the corner, manning the radio network with newfound maturity. "Got reports of more bikes arriving at the warehouse," James said, spreading out a map marked with recent sightings. "Different patches, different clubs, Chains is calling in favors." Deputy Wilson nodded grimly. "County finally promised backup, but they're still days out. We're on our own until then." Rachel studied the map, noting patterns in the motorcycle sightings. "They're probing our response times, testing different approaches. See these patterns? They're looking for gaps in our coverage." Dr. Chen added her own observations. 3 people came into the clinic today with similar stories, bikers following them, taking pictures of their homes and families. They're trying to build pressure again. "But it's not working like before," Maria interjected. "People are standing together. When those bikers followed Mrs. Rodriguez home from the bakery, she had 5 neighbors on their porches within minutes. They're learning they can't isolate us anymore." Rachel was about to respond when Bobby's voice cut through the discussion. "Multiple bikes approaching from the south." His voice carried the urgency of someone who had spotted something different. "Lots of them, more than before." Everyone moved to the clinic's windows. In the distance, they could hear its growing thunder of dozens of motorcycles. Rachel's combat instincts kicked into high gear. "This is it," she said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had faced similar moments before. "They're done testing. Bobby, sound the alert. Everyone to their positions." The town's warning system activated with practiced efficiency. Lights began coming on throughout Riverside Junction, cameras whirred to life, and observers moved to their designated posts. Through the radio network, Rachel could hear the community responding exactly as they'd drilled. "I count at least 30 bikes," came a report from the school's observation post. "They're splitting into groups, moving down Main Street and Parker Avenue." Rachel grabbed her radio, her voice clear and commanding. "All points, maintain distance and keep recording. No one engages directly. Remember your training. The Iron Serpents' approach was different this time, more coordinated, more aggressive. They moved through town in organized groups, their engines roaring in the Texas night. Leading them was Chains, with Butcher and several new faces Rachel didn't recognize. They're heading for Miller's, Deputy Wilson reported. At least 15 bikes. The rest are spreading out through town. Rachel was already moving, Frank and James falling in beside her as they headed for the gas station. They could see the bikers circling the property, their headlights cutting through the darkness like searching eyes. Inside the store, Bobby had taken his position at the security monitors, his young face set with determination. "All cameras operational," he reported, getting clear shots of everyone. The Iron Serpents pulled into the station in formation, their bikes arranged in a semicircle facing the store. Chains dismounted first, followed by his lieutenants. Rachel noted their positioning, the way they moved. They'd planned this carefully. "Last chance, nurse," Chains called out, his voice carrying across the lot. "Tell your little neighborhood watch to stand down. Call off your cameras and patrols. Let things go back to how they should be." Rachel stepped outside, aware of Frank positioning himself near the door and James moving to cover the back. Through her earpiece, she could hear the town's network tracking every movement, every position. "You still don't understand what's happening here," she replied, her voice steady. "Look around you, Chains. Really look." Throughout town, lights were on in every house. People stood on their porches, phones and cameras recording. Pickup trucks filled with ranchers and mechanics had appeared at strategic points. The Iron Serpents' show of force was being met with a wall of witnesses and documentation. "You think numbers give you power?" Rachel continued. "Every person you've brought here is another face on camera, another piece of evidence. How many of your friends are willing to risk that kind of exposure?" Butcher revved his engine aggressively. "Shut her up, Chains. Let's show them what real power looks like." But Rachel could see the uncertainty creeping into some of the bikers' expressions. They'd come expecting to find a scared town ready to break under pressure. Instead, they found themselves surrounded by calm, organized resistance. The night air crackled with tension as both sides held their positions. Rachel knew the next few moments would determine everything. The Iron Serpents had committed themselves to this show of force. Now they had to decide whether to follow through or back down. And somewhere in the darkness, watching and recording, the people of Riverside Junction waited to see if their preparations would hold. The tension at Miller's fuel stop finally snapped like a stretched wire. Chains made his move, but not in the way Rachel had expected. Instead of attacking directly, he gave a sharp whistle, a signal that set off a chain reaction across town. Through her radio, reports started flooding in from all sectors of Riverside Junction. "They're hitting the school." Maria's voice crackled through the earpiece. The sound of breaking glass punctuated her words. "6 bikes. They're trying to break into the main building." Before Rachel could respond, James Washington's voice cut in. "Auto shop under attack. They're throwing Molotov cocktails at the garage doors." Similar reports cascaded in from across town: the clinic, the hardware store, the supermarket. The Iron Serpents had launched a coordinated assault on multiple targets simultaneously, trying to overwhelm the town's defenses. Chain's smirk grew wider as he watched Rachel listening to the reports. "Hear that? That's the sound of your little system breaking down. Can't be everywhere at once, can you, nurse?" But Rachel's expression didn't show the panic he'd expected. Instead, a small, knowing smile crossed her face. "You're right. I can't be everywhere." She keyed her radio. "All points. Execute Protocol Thunder." The response was immediate and overwhelming. At the school, the newly installed sprinkler system activated, drenching the attackers. Emergency lights blazed on, catching them in stark relief as cameras recorded every move. The auto shop's Molotov cocktails splashed harmlessly against newly installed steel shutters, while hidden cameras captured clear images of every attacker. At the clinic, Dr. Chen's voice reported with satisfaction. Attackers trapped in the parking lot. New barriers deployed successfully. The sound of motorcycle engines racing futilely against sturdy barricades filled the background. Throughout town, The Iron Serpents found their coordinated attack met with equally coordinated defense. Every target they'd chosen had been fortified, every approach covered by cameras and lights. Worse, they found themselves surrounded by citizens who weren't running in fear, but standing their ground, recording everything. Chain's face contorted with rage as he realized his master plan was unraveling. "Butcher!" he shouted. "Light this place up!" The massive biker reached for something in his saddlebag, but Rachel's voice cut through the night with combat-hardened authority. "I wouldn't, unless you want to explain to the ATF why you're carrying explosive materials across state lines." On cue, Frank Miller emerged from the store, shotgun now clearly visible. James Washington's crew of mechanics appeared from the shadows, carrying their own weapons. Deputy Wilson's patrol car pulled up, lights flashing, followed by more vehicles bearing reinforcements from neighboring towns. "Your guys are trapped at 6 different locations," Rachel continued calmly. "Every action they've taken has been recorded. We've got faces, license plates, and enough evidence to bring in federal task forces. How many of your new friends want that kind of attention?" As if to emphasize her point, more trucks appeared, surrounding the gas station. Local ranchers, shopkeepers, and ordinary citizens formed a ring around the Iron Serpents, their headlights illuminating the scene like a stadium. Through her earpiece, Rachel could hear the situation resolving across town. The attackers, finding themselves caught and documented, were standing down one by one. The sound of motorcycle engines died away as reality set in. "Last chance, Chains," Rachel said, her voice carrying across the now quiet station. "You can leave now, take your people, and never come back, or you can push this further and deal with consequences you're not ready for." Butcher revved his engine aggressively. "We don't back down," he growled. But several other bikers were already turning their machines around, wanting no part of what was coming. Chains found himself in the position he'd tried to put the town in, surrounded, exposed, and running out of options. His carefully planned show of force had turned into a demonstration of his own powerlessness. "This isn't over," he snarled, but the threat sounded hollow even to his own ears. "Yes, it is," Rachel replied, using his own tactics against him. "Look around. Really look. Every person here is willing to stand against you. Every camera is recording. Every action you take digs your hole deeper. You're not facing a scared town anymore. You're facing a community that knows how to fight back." The sound of sirens grew louder as county reinforcements finally arrived. Chains looked at his dwindling crew, seeing the uncertainty in their faces. His power had always relied on fear and isolation, but Riverside Junction had learned to overcome both. With a curse, he kicked his bike to life. "Let's go," he ordered, but only half his crew followed immediately. The others hesitated, looking at the wall of witnesses and cameras surrounding them. "Remember this," Rachel called out as they prepared to leave. "Remember what happened when you pushed a town too far. Remember what happened when you threatened the wrong people." The Iron Serpents rode away into the night, their departure tracked by cameras and observers until they were well beyond town limits. As their engines faded into the distance, the people of Riverside Junction began to emerge from their positions, gathering at Miller's fuel stop. Rachel surveyed the crowd, mechanics, teachers, shopkeepers, and families, all united by their stand against intimidation. They had faced down the storm together and emerged stronger. In their faces, she saw not just relief but pride and determination. The combat nurse knew that somewhere out there, Chains and his crew were nursing their wounded pride. But she also knew that Riverside Junction would never again be an easy target. The town had learned its strength, and that was a lesson that wouldn't be forgotten. The aftermath of the Iron Serpents' failed assault on Riverside Junction brought changes nobody had expected. As the sun rose the next morning, casting long shadows across Miller's fuel stop, the town buzzed with a new kind of energy. It wasn't just relief at having driven off the bikers. It was something deeper, a profound realization of their collective strength. Rachel arrived at the station early, finding Frank already behind the counter, methodically logging the night's events. Bobby Thompson sat nearby, dark circles under his eyes from manning the radio network through the night. but his face glowed with pride. Outside, James Washington and his crew were checking the security cameras, reinforcing mounts that had worked loose during the confrontation. "County Sheriff finally showed up," Frank reported, sliding a cup of coffee across the counter to Rachel. "Spent 2 hours going through our camera footage. Said he's never seen such organized resistance from a small town." Deputy Wilson arrived shortly after, her uniform wrinkled from the long night but her eyes bright with satisfaction. "Just got word from the state police," she announced. "They picked up 3 of the Iron Serpents trying to leave the state. Found outstanding warrants on 2 of them." Dr. Chen joined them, carrying a thick folder of documented incidents and photographs. "Every business in town contributed to this," she explained, patting the folder. "Times, dates, faces, license plates, everything we recorded over the past weeks. The FBI's organized crime unit is very interested." Rachel listened to the reports, noting how the townspeople moved with new confidence. The fear that had gripped Riverside Junction weeks ago had been replaced by something stronger, a sense of community and shared purpose that no amount of intimidation could shake. "They hit Martinez's garage pretty hard," James reported, joining the group. "Broke windows, tried to start fires, but here's the thing. By sunrise, half the town was there helping clean up. Mrs. Rodriguez brought coffee and pastries from the bakery. The high school kids showed up to help sweep glass. It's like we're finally a real community," Maria Delgado finished, entering the store with an armful of newspapers. "Look at this. Papers from 3 counties are covering what happened. They're calling it a blueprint for standing up to organized intimidation." The headlines told the story. "Small town stands united against biker gang. Riverside Junction shows how to fight back. Community organization defeats criminal intimidation." But it was the local paper's headline that captured it best. Riverside Junction, the town that refused to break. Throughout the day, people streamed into Miller's fuel stop, not just for gas or supplies, but to share stories and check on each other. The gas station had become more than a business. It was a symbol of their resistance, a gathering place for a community that had discovered its strength. "You know what's really changing?" Bobby observed from his spot near the radio. "People aren't just going home and locking their doors anymore. They're stopping to talk, making plans, organizing neighborhood watches even though the threat's gone." Rachel nodded, understanding what the young man meant. Her time in Iraq had taught her that the strongest defense against violence wasn't weapons or walls. It was community solidarity. Riverside Junction had learned that lesson well. Late in the afternoon, a state police detective arrived to take official statements. As Rachel watched him interview townspeople, she noticed how naturally they worked together now. The hardware store owner provided security footage, which the high school teacher had already logged and time-stamped. The auto shop workers offered detailed descriptions of the attackers, supplemented by photographs from the clinic's files. "Never seen anything like this," the detective admitted to Rachel during a break. "Most towns, they wait for law enforcement to solve their problems. But you folks, you gave us everything we need for solid prosecutions. And more importantly, you showed these gangs that small towns aren't easy targets anymore." As evening approached, Frank called an informal gathering at the station. People brought food and drinks, turning the parking lot into an impromptu celebration. Rachel watched from the sidelines as townspeople who had barely known each other weeks ago now talked and laughed like old friends. "You did this," Deputy Wilson said, joining Rachel at her observation post. "You showed us how to stand together." Rachel shook her head. "I just showed you what was already there. The strength was always in the community. You just needed to learn how to use it." The sound of motorcycles in the distance made a few people tense, but it passed without incident. Rachel noticed how differently people reacted now, not with fear but with alertness and readiness. The Iron Serpents had wanted to break the town's spirit. Instead, they'd forged it into something unbreakable. As the sun set on Riverside Junction, casting the gas station in golden light, Rachel thought about her time in Iraq, about the communities she'd seen there that had learned to stand against violence. The lessons were the same everywhere. Unity was stronger than fear, organization more powerful than intimidation. Frank approached her with a fresh cup of coffee. "You thinking of moving on?" he asked quietly. Now that the trouble's passed? Rachel looked around at the gathered townspeople, at Bobby proudly monitoring his radio, at Dr. Chen sharing stories with Maria, at James and his crew planning new security improvements. She thought about the combat hospitals where she'd learned her skills, and this small Texas town where she'd found a new purpose for them. No, she replied, surprising herself with how right it felt. I think I've found where I belong. The transformation of Riverside Junction didn't end with the Iron Serpents' departure. In the months that followed, the small Texas town became something few would have predicted, a model for community solidarity and organized resistance against intimidation. The systems Rachel had helped put in place didn't disappear when the threat was gone. Instead, they evolved into something more permanent and profound. Miller's fuel stop remained the heart of the town's network, though now the radio system tracked more benign matters: weather warnings, stranded travelers, community events. Frank had installed a proper coffee corner where the old filing cabinet used to be, and there was always someone stopping by to check in or share news. Bobby Thompson, no longer the nervous teenager, had become the station's full-time manager. He kept the radio network running smoothly, trained new volunteers, and maintained the security systems with a professionalism that made his mentor proud. The skills he'd learned during the crisis had given him purpose and direction. "You know what I realized?" he said to Rachel one quiet afternoon, as they reviewed the station's updated emergency protocols. "What happened here? It wasn't just about fighting off those bikers. It was about learning who we could be." Rachel understood exactly what he meant. She saw it every day in the way the town operated, the natural cooperation, the watchfulness that came not from fear but from caring. Dr. Chen's clinic had become a community center as much as a medical facility. Maria Delgado had started teaching self-defense classes at the school. James Washington's auto shop now offered free safety inspections for elderly residents. Deputy Wilson, recently promoted to sheriff after her predecessor's retirement, made community engagement a cornerstone of her department. "Other towns keep asking how we did it," she told Rachel during one of their regular coffee meetings. "How we stood up to a gang when bigger places just give in. I tell them it starts with one person willing to take a stand, and a community willing to stand together." The Iron Serpents had become something of a legend in Riverside Junction, not for their intimidation, but for how the town had overcome it. Their story had spread, inspiring other communities facing similar threats. Rachel occasionally got calls from other towns asking for advice, and she always told them the same thing. The strength is already there. You just have to learn how to use it. 1 year to the day after the final confrontation, the town gathered at Miller's fuel stop for a celebration. The station's forecourt had been transformed, strings of lights crisscrossing overhead, tables laden with food brought by every family in town. Children played while their parents talked, and the evening air was filled with laughter and music. Frank Miller, his weathered face creased with smile lines, stood beside Rachel as they watched the festivities. "Remember that first day?" he asked. "When you were just filling up your truck and those bikers rolled in? Who'd have thought it would lead to all this?" Rachel smiled, thinking back to that moment. She'd come to Riverside Junction looking for quiet, for a place to heal from the wounds of war. Instead, she'd found a purpose and a community that had become family. Mrs. Rodriguez from the bakery approached them, carrying a cake decorated with the town's new unofficial motto, "Standing together, standing strong." The phrase had become more than words. It was a testament to how far they'd come. "You gave us something precious," the baker said to Rachel, her eyes misting slightly. "Not just safety, but pride. Dignity. We're not victims anymore. We're guardians of our own community." As the evening progressed, Rachel found herself sharing stories with newer residents, explaining how the town's warning systems worked, how the community had learned to coordinate and protect itself. The newer folks listened with interest, but it was hard for them to imagine the fear that had once gripped these streets. Riverside Junction had become too strong for that kind of fear to take root again. Deputy Wilson, now Sheriff Wilson, took the makeshift stage to make a speech, but her words were interrupted by the distant sound of motorcycles. Rachel noticed how differently people reacted now. No fear, no tension, just calm awareness. The bikes passed without slowing, their riders likely noting the crowd of confident, watchful citizens. "That's the real victory," James Washington observed, joining Rachel at her observation post. "Not that we drove them away, but that we're not afraid anymore. We know who we are now." As the celebration continued under the Texas stars, Rachel thought about how far they'd all come. The combat nurse who'd sought solitude had found family. The frightened town had found its courage. The scattered individuals had become an unshakable community. Bobby's voice came over the radio. He was still manning his post, ever vigilant. All quiet on all approaches, clear skies and calm winds. The weather code they'd once used to warn of danger now carried its literal meaning, but the readiness remained. Rachel looked around at her adopted home, at Frank teaching young kids about radio protocols, at Dr. Chen and Maria planning new community programs, at Sheriff Wilson discussing county-wide cooperation with visiting officials. The Iron Serpents had tried to break this town's spirit. Instead, they'd helped forge it into something unbreakable. "You know," Frank said, joining her again with a fresh cup of coffee, "some folks still call you the nurse who saved the town." Rachel shook her head, smiling. "No," she replied, watching the community she'd helped build. "The town saved itself. I just showed them how." The stars wheeled overhead as Riverside Junction celebrated not just its victory, but its transformation. The small Texas town at the crossroads had become something more, a beacon of hope, a model of resistance, and a testament to the power of standing together. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.